In 1955, Ford built a car that could run on jet fuel, diesel, kerosene, or even peanut oil, and then Ford made sure almost nobody ever found out about it. Not a single press release. No public unveiling. No magazine cover story. For nearly 70 years, this project sat buried in Ford's internal archives until a company historian accidentally pulled it out in 2022 and the automotive world realized Detroit had been sitting on one of the strangest experiments in American car history. What you're about to hear isn't a rumor pieced together from forum posts. It comes straight from Ford's own engineering documents, and once you understand why they buried it, you'll understand why Ford never wanted you to know this car existed in the first place. To understand why Ford did this, you have to go back to the mid-1950s, when Detroit's engineers were convinced that jet engines were about to replace pistons in everyday cars. World War II had turned turbine technology from a military secret into something engineers whispered about at every automaker in Michigan. General Motors was already building its Firebird turbine concepts. Chrysler was quietly developing what would eventually become its famous 55-car turbine program. And Ford, not wanting to be left behind in what everyone assumed was the next great leap in automotive propulsion, decided to run its own experiment. But instead of building something flashy and new, Ford's engineers reached for the car that had just become the company's golden child. The Thunderbird had debuted in February 1954 to massive public excitement, and by December 1955, Ford's engineering team had a wild idea. What if they ripped the piston V8 out of a Thunderbird and dropped in a real aircraft turboshaft engine instead? They sourced a Boeing 502-8C turboshaft, a compact engine originally designed for helicopters and industrial use, weighing around 330 pounds and rated at 175 horsepower. Ford's engineers adapted it to fit under the hood of a stock 1955 Thunderbird body, and according to internal documents, the total cost of the project came out to $188,000, a serious sum of money for what was essentially an internal science experiment nobody outside the company was ever supposed to see. The stated purpose, written plainly in Ford's own engineering notes, was to obtain a usable and reliable gas turbine vehicle for appraising the special advantages and problems associated with this type of power plant. In plain English, Ford wanted to know if jet engines actually belonged in cars, and they wanted to find out quietly before committing to anything public. Here's where it gets interesting. A turbine engine doesn't work anything like the piston engine under your hood right now. There are no pistons hammering up and down, no crankshaft converting that motion into rotation, none of the mechanical complexity you'd expect. Instead, a turbine sucks in air, compresses it, mixes it with fuel, ignites it, and lets the expanding gas spin a turbine wheel at incredibly high speed. That spinning motion gets converted down to something the wheels can actually use. The result is an engine with far fewer moving parts, capable of running on almost any combustible liquid you can pour into it. Ford's own engineers reportedly experimented with multiple fuel types in this Thunderbird, and that flexibility genuinely excited them. Imagine a world where your car doesn't care whether you fill it with gasoline, diesel, or kerosene from a farm supply store. In 1955, that sounded like the future. But turbines came with a catalog of problems that piston engines simply didn't have, and this is where Ford's excitement started running into hard physical limits. Turbines spool up slowly, which means the instant throttle response drivers expect from a car is almost impossible to replicate. Push the gas pedal on a turbine car and there's a lag before power actually arrives, a delay that makes the car feel disconnected from the driver's right foot. Turbines also run brutally hot enough that heat management inside a passenger cabin becomes a serious engineering headache. And perhaps worst of all for a company trying to sell cars to regular families, turbines are thirsty. Fuel economy on early turbine vehicles was often dramatically worse than a comparable piston engine, which is a difficult sell in a car meant for daily driving rather than a museum display. Chrysler would run into these exact same walls a few years later with their far more publicized turbine program, and it's a big part of why that famous experiment, despite putting 55 cars directly into the hands of American families, eventually got shut down too. So Ford tested their turbine Thunderbird, gathered their data, quietly filed away the results, and then did something almost nobody expected. They didn't scrap the idea entirely. They pivoted it toward a completely different application, one that made a lot more engineering sense. If a small turbine struggled to deliver a smooth, responsive driving experience in a sports car, what if the real opportunity wasn't in cars at all, but in heavy trucks, where constant high-speed cruising mattered more than throttle response? That question eventually led Ford down a path toward one of the most jaw-dropping vehicles most people have never heard of, a machine so wild it makes the turbine Thunderbird look almost conservative by comparison. In 1964, at the same World's Fair where Ford was busy unveiling the Mustang to a roaring crowd, the company quietly rolled out something else entirely. It was called Big Red, a genuinely massive experimental semi-truck standing 13 feet tall and stretching nearly 100 feet long with its tandem trailers attached. Under that towering hood sat a 600-horsepower gas turbine engine, the same basic principle from that secret Thunderbird years earlier, scaled up into something that looked like it belonged on a runway rather than an American highway. Big Red wowed fairgoers, toured the country as a rolling piece of jet-age propaganda, and then, when turbine technology once again failed to add up economically against reliable diesel power, it was mothballed and largely forgotten. For decades, most people assumed Big Red had simply been scrapped, lost the same way so much of Detroit's experimental history quietly disappeared into landfills and warehouse fires. It took a small team of dedicated researchers years of digging through old records and abandoned lots before they finally tracked down the surviving remains, proving that even Ford's biggest, boldest turbine gamble had been hiding in plain sight the entire time. Now here's the part that connects everything back to that original secret Thunderbird, and it's the reason this whole story stayed buried for as long as it did. Unlike Chrysler, which turned its turbine program into a massive public relations spectacle, handing keys to 50 ordinary American families and generating newspaper headlines across the country, Ford made the opposite choice. They kept their turbine Thunderbird entirely internal. No press conference. No public test drives. No magazine road tests. It existed purely as engineering data, tested, documented, and then locked away in company files where it stayed for roughly 67 years. It wasn't until March of 2022 that Ford's own company archivist finally shared the original testing notes and photos publicly, and only then did automotive historians and enthusiasts realize this car had existed at all. Think about that for a second. A running, functional jet-powered Ford Thunderbird sat completely unknown to the public for longer than most people's entire lifetimes, while Chrysler's flashier turbine program became legendary and Ford's quieter, arguably more scientifically disciplined experiment got erased from public memory almost entirely. Why would a company bury something this genuinely cool? The most likely answer isn't some dramatic conspiracy. It's far more mundane and honestly a little more interesting once you think it through. Ford's turbine Thunderbird was never meant to be a product. It was a research tool, built to answer an internal engineering question rather than to impress the public. Once the answer came back mixed, promising in theory but impractical for everyday driving, there was simply no business reason to show it off. Publicizing a car that didn't work as intended risked creating exactly the kind of skepticism about turbine technology that Ford didn't want attached to its brand, especially while GM and Chrysler were still chasing the same dream. So instead of showcasing an interesting failure, Ford just quietly filed it away and moved on to the next experiment, which is exactly what led to Big Red a decade later. If you've made it this far and you're wondering whether any of this actually mattered in the long run, here's the twist. The gas turbine automobile as a mainstream product never happened, not from Ford, not from Chrysler, not from GM. But the underlying research from all three companies didn't disappear into nothing. That knowledge fed directly into turbine technology used in military vehicles, auxiliary power units, and eventually modern jet engines that power the aircraft you might be flying on right now. Ford's secret Thunderbird wasn't a failure buried out of embarrassment. It was one small, quiet data point in a much bigger story about an entire industry testing the absolute limits of what a car engine could be, decades before anyone had the language to call it innovation for innovation's sake. Somewhere in a Ford archive right now, There are probably more documents like this one, projects nobody outside the company has ever heard of, quietly waiting for someone to go digging. So here's my question for you. If Ford had pushed forward with turbine power instead of burying this project, do you think jet-powered cars could have actually become mainstream? Or were the fuel economy and throttle lag problems always going to kill the idea no matter how much money got thrown at it? Let me know what you think in the comments, and if you want more buried automotive history like this pulled straight out of company archives, hit that subscribe button because there's a lot more forgotten history where this came from.